Number 1. The Viking funeral wasn't just fire and glory. The popular image of a Viking funeral, a flaming longship drifting into the sea, has its roots in truth, but the full ritual was far more elaborate and symbolic. The 10th century Arab traveller Ahmed ibn Fadlan observed a Viking funeral on the Volga River and described an astonishing ritual involving days of feasting, sacrifice, and spiritual preparation. When a Viking chieftain died, a slave girl, often a concubine, would volunteer, or be chosen, to die with him. Over 10 days, she would be treated like royalty, drinking heavily, visiting each of the chieftain's warriors to say goodbye through ritualized sex, and then finally, she would be stabbed and strangled by an old woman known as the Angel of Death. The chief's body would be laid in a ship with weapons, treasures, and his sacrificed animals. The entire vessel would then be set on fire. For Vikings, this wasn't just a send-off. It was a gateway to Valhalla, the warrior's paradise, and the fire purified the body for the journey. This practice reveals not just their brutality, but a deep and mystical belief system rooted in sacrifice, honor, and transformation. Number 2. Viking helmets had no horns. Despite centuries of pop culture depictions, there is no evidence that Vikings ever wore horned helmets into battle. This myth began in the 1800s when costume designers for Wagner's operas wanted to visually amplify the Norse characters. They borrowed imagery from earlier Bronze Age ceremonial gear, some of which did include horns, but it had nothing to do with Vikings. Real Viking helmets were practical, iron caps with a nose guard or a spectacle-like faceplate, built for functionality in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Horns would have been wildly impractical, giving enemies something to grab and unbalancing the warrior's head. Yet, the image stuck and was embraced in Romantic-era nationalism and fantasy art. Ironically, the horned helmet, now an unmistakable Viking symbol, never sailed on a single Viking ship. It's a fabrication that tells us more about modern imaginations than medieval reality. Number 3. The blood eagle was real and terrifying. Few Viking punishments have achieved such a ghastly reputation as the blood eagle. According to the Norse sagas, particularly the Orkneyinga saga and Ragnar saga, this horrific execution method was reserved for those who deeply wronged a Viking or disgraced a family. The condemned would have their ribs cut from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings, while their lungs were spread over the ribs, still heaving as they died in agony. Historians debated for decades whether this was a literary metaphor or a real execution method. Recent scholarship, however, suggests that it might indeed have been performed, though rarely, as a ritual sacrifice to Odin, the god of war, death, and wisdom. The act was both punishment and tribute, blending the sacred and the savage. The blood eagle reflects the Viking belief that pain purified the soul, and public death ensured honor or eternal infamy. For them, fear was not just a tool. It was a sacred force. Number 4. Viking women had more rights than most medieval women. While Viking society was undeniably patriarchal, women in Norse cultures enjoyed rights and freedoms unheard of in many parts of medieval Europe. Viking women could own property, initiate divorce, inherit land, and even command ships or run trading empires if they were widowed. Gravestones and runestones frequently mention powerful women who managed estates or sailed across the sea. One example is Aud the Deep-Minded, a 9th century Viking matriarch who led her family across the North Atlantic and helped found settlements in Iceland. She commanded ships and slaves and was buried upright in a ship, a sign of immense respect and power. Women could also become shield maidens, although this is still debated. Archaeological finds, like the Birka warrior burial in Sweden, once assumed male but proven female via DNA testing, suggest that some women did fight. In mythology, women wielded power too. Seeresses, Valkyries, and goddesses like Freya were all central figures. For their time, Viking women stood uniquely empowered, commanding a balance of independence, reverence, and fear. Number 5. Vikings had a deep love for grooming. Forget the stereotype of dirty, unkempt savages. Vikings were exceptionally clean and vain by medieval standards. Archaeological digs routinely uncover grooming tools like tweezers, razors, combs, and even ear picks. These were often made from bone or antler and kept in decorated pouches. Weekly baths were the norm, and Saturday was known as Lorgadega in Old Norse, literally bath day. Vikings dyed their hair, especially blonde, which was highly prized. Lye-based soaps were used to lighten brown hair. Long hair and well-kept beards were signs of power and masculinity, often intricately braided. Saxon chroniclers even noted that Viking raiders attracted local women due to their cleanliness and good grooming, something that angered English men who could not compete. The warrior's vanity wasn't just for appearances. It was linked to pride, identity, and even religious purity. A Viking's comb wasn't just for his hair. It was a symbol of civilization in a sea of chaos. Number 6. They built the fastest ships in Europe. The longship was the Vikings' greatest technological achievement, sleek, fast, and terrifying. These vessels had a shallow draft, allowing them to navigate rivers as easily as oceans, and they could be carried overland when needed. With symmetrical ends, they could reverse direction without turning, and their lightweight design enabled speeds of up to 15 knots. Faster than most medieval warships, longships allowed for surprise attacks deep into continental Europe, including raids on Paris and Constantinople. The dragon-headed prow served a dual purpose: to terrify enemies and ward off evil spirits. Ship burials were a spiritual use of these vessels. Leaders were buried inside full-scale ships, sometimes with horses, weapons, and entire crews. Each ship was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of freedom, identity, and connection with the sea gods. Without their ships, the Vikings would never have become legends. Their longships were both lifeblood and legacy. Number 7. Viking raids were a strategic business. While Viking raids are often described as mindless pillaging, they were far more organized and economically strategic than most realize. Raids were typically timed in the spring and summer, with clear targets: monasteries, port towns, and poorly defended trade routes. These locations held not just gold, but slaves, an incredibly valuable commodity in Norse economies. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 CE wasn't just shocking because of its violence, but because it was brilliantly calculated. Monasteries were rich, unguarded, and isolated. Vikings knew it. They also exploited local politics, playing rival kingdoms against each other and even serving as mercenaries when not raiding. In time, many raiders transitioned into traders and settlers. Towns like Dublin, York, and Novgorod began as Viking camps. Raiding was simply one stage of an economic strategy that involved warfare, trade, and eventual integration. The Viking Age wasn't just an age of violence, it was an age of calculated expansion. Number 8. They reached North America, 500 years before Columbus. Long before Columbus, Vikings were the first Europeans to reach North America. Around the year 1000 CE, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland and landed on the shores of what is today Newfoundland, Canada. He called it Vinland, supposedly due to the presence of wild grapes. The Norse built temporary settlements there, the most famous being Elant's Auxiliary Meadows, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Archaeological remains confirm Norse-style buildings, ironworking, and tools far predating Columbus. However, Viking colonization in North America was short-lived. Hostile relations with the indigenous peoples, the Skraelings, supply issues, and internal disputes caused the settlers to abandon the effort after a few years. Still, they achieved something extraordinary. In an age when most Europeans feared sailing into open seas, the Vikings explored across the Atlantic and walked the forests of a new world, half a millennium before anyone else. Number 9. Berserkers were more than just madmen. The term berserker comes from the Old Norse berserker, meaning bear shirt or bear shirt. These elite Viking warriors were said to enter battle in a trance-like fury, immune to pain and filled with supernatural strength. Ancient sources describe them howling like animals, biting their shields, and killing friend or foe indiscriminately. Modern scholars suggest this berserker rage may have been induced by hallucinogenic mushrooms, like Amanita muscaria, alcohol, or intense ritual. Their minds were altered for war, turning them into human weapons. Others think it was a psychological training or inherited mental state, what we might now call dissociation or battle madness. Whatever the source, berserkers terrified their enemies and inspired myth. They were Odin's chosen, warriors who had left their humanity behind for something darker. Their legend endured because they represented the untamed power of war, a force that couldn't be reasoned with, only feared. Number 10. Viking laws were surprisingly sophisticated. Viking societies had complex legal systems that were enforced not by kings, but by assemblies called things. These were gatherings where free men debated disputes, passed judgments, and resolved issues collectively. Iceland's Althing, founded in 930 CE, is one of the world's oldest parliaments still in operation today. Legal matters were often decided by the community, with a law speaker reciting the rules from memory. Crimes like murder required a weregild or manprice, essentially a financial compensation to the victim's family. If it wasn't paid, blood feuds could erupt. Even exile was a legal sentence. Being outlawed meant losing all protection under the law. Anyone could kill an outlaw without punishment. But this too had structure. Outlawry was temporary or permanent, with specific conditions for return. Vikings didn't live in lawless chaos. Their world ran on honor, memory, and negotiation. Even amid axes and raids, justice was never forgotten. Number 11. Viking swords were named and treasured. To the Vikings, a sword was more than a weapon, it was a soul-bound companion. Swords were often given names like Legbiter, Goldhilt, or Widowmaker, and were passed down through generations like sacred relics. These names weren't symbolic. They were believed to carry the weapon's spirit and history. Crafting a sword was a master's work. Many Viking blades, such as the famed Ulfbert swords, were made with crucible steel, far superior to what was common in Europe at the time. Metallurgical analysis shows some blades had carbon content comparable to modern steel, likely imported through trade with the Middle East. Because of their rarity and cost, swords were status symbols. Losing one in battle was a disgrace. Burying one with a warrior was an honor. The sword wasn't just for killing, it was the guardian of a man's legacy, pride, and name. Number 12. They wrote with runes, more than just symbols. Vikings wrote using runes, a script known as the Futhark, named after its first 6 characters. These weren't just a writing system, they were believed to possess mystical power. Runes could be carved into weapons for strength, into graves for remembrance, and into charms for protection. Some rune inscriptions are poetic, such as the famous rock runestone in Sweden, which contains one of the longest early runic texts, an epic mix of myth, prophecy, and riddles. Others are more personal. Thorstein carved these runes, "Remember me," or even humorous graffiti etched into wooden bone. Runes were considered sacred, often associated with the god Odin, who, according to myth, sacrificed himself by hanging on the world tree, Yggdrasil, to gain their knowledge. To the Vikings, writing was more than communication. It was an act of magic and memory, a way to etch one's will into the bones of the world. Number 13. Vikings traded from Baghdad to Byzantium. Though known for raiding, the Vikings were also prolific traders. Norse merchants followed river routes across modern-day Russia and Ukraine, forming trade links that reached as far as Baghdad, Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and even the caliphates of the Islamic world. Arabic coins, silver dirhams, have been found in massive quantities in Viking burial sites. The sheer volume of Islamic silver in Scandinavia stunned archaeologists. This wasn't trickle-down commerce, it was a thriving, deliberate trade network. In the East, Norse traders were known as the Rus, and they established settlements along the rivers, including Kiev and Novgorod, which later became foundations for the Russian state. In Byzantium, Viking mercenaries formed the elite Varangian Guard, personal bodyguards to the Byzantine emperors. The Vikings weren't isolated marauders. They were part of a global economy, linking cold northern fjords to the warm palaces of Baghdad. Number 14. Viking settlements were built to last. When Vikings settled the land, they didn't just pitch tents, they built thriving communities with advanced engineering. Excavations in places like Jorvik, modern-day York, show that Viking towns had streets, workshops, drainage systems, and even rudimentary sewers. Homes were longhouses, rectangular structures made of timber, turf, or stone with thatched roofs. The hearth was the heart of the home, providing heat, light, and a place for storytelling and worship. Settlements in Iceland and Greenland show how adaptive they were. On Greenland's frozen shores, Norse settlers grew barley, built churches, and even traded with Europe. The remains of Valsa Church still stand today, a testament to their craftsmanship and devotion. The image of Vikings as drifters is misleading. When they chose to settle, they built with care, vision, and permanence. Number 15. They had their own calendar and seasonal festivals. The Vikings followed a lunar calendar, dividing the year into two main seasons, winter and summer. Each had specific rituals, holidays, and festivals rooted in both practical agriculture and Norse mythology. The most important was Jol, the midwinter festival that later evolved into modern Christmas. It was a time for feasting, honoring ancestors, and making offerings to Odin. The blot, or sacrificial feast, was central. Animals were slaughtered, and their blood was smeared on sacred altars or temple walls. Spring brought Sigablot, a victory offering to the gods for success in upcoming raids. In autumn, they celebrated Winter Nights, a harvest festival marking the end of the raiding season. These celebrations weren't just merry gatherings, they were spiritual acts tying the community to the gods, the land, and the cycles of the cosmos. Number 16. Viking gods were raw, complex, and human. Unlike the omnipotent deities of other religions, Norse gods were fallible, complex, and vividly human. Odin, the All-Father, was wise but manipulative. He gave up an eye for wisdom and hung himself for runes. Thor, the thunder god, was strong but often foolish. He loved drinking, brawling, and his magical hammer, Mjolnir. Then there was Loki, trickster, shapeshifter, and chaos incarnate. Neither wholly good nor evil, Loki fathered monsters like Fenrir the wolf and the world serpent Jormungandr, yet also helped the gods in critical moments. The gods weren't worshipped to be obeyed. They were revered, feared, and even challenged. They existed in a web of fate, known as Wyrd, that not even they could escape. At Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse, many of them were prophesied to die, and they accepted it. This made the Viking religion emotionally resonant. Their gods struggled like they did, laughed like they did, and ultimately died like they would. Number 17. They used sunstones to navigate the seas. Long before compasses reached northern Europe, Vikings were navigating vast oceans using an ingenious tool, the sunstone. According to medieval Icelandic texts, sunstones helped Viking sailors locate the position of the sun even on cloudy days or when the sun was just below the horizon. Modern science has confirmed this is plausible. Crystals like Iceland spar, a form of calcite, can polarize light, allowing a skilled navigator to detect the sun's position through cloud cover by rotating the stone and observing light patterns. Combined with their mastery of wind patterns, wave behavior, landmarks, and celestial navigation, this technique allowed Vikings to sail confidently across thousands of miles of open ocean, with no maps, no stars, and no GPS. It's one of history's most remarkable examples of indigenous technology and intuition working hand in hand. Number 18. The Norse believed in 9 worlds. In Norse cosmology, the universe was made up of 9 interconnected worlds, all held together by the immense world tree, Yggdrasil. These realms were not metaphors. They were real places in Viking belief, with distinct inhabitants and rules. Asgard, realm of the gods. Midgard, world of humans. Jotunheim, land of giants. Vanaheim, home of the fertility gods. Niflheim, icy realm of the dead. Muspelheim, land of fire and chaos. Alfheim, world of light elves. Svartalfheim, realm of dwarfs and dark elves. Helheim, underworld ruled by Hel, Loki's daughter. These weren't merely spiritual domains. They explained nature, morality, life, and death. The cosmos itself was a battlefield between order and chaos, light and darkness, destiny and defiance. Yggdrasil's roots were said to be gnawed by the dragon Nidhogg, a constant reminder that even the center of creation was vulnerable. Number 19. Viking children were raised for strength and story. In Viking culture, childhood was preparation. Boys were trained early in weapon use, physical labor, and survival skills. Girls learned farming, household management, and healing. But beyond survival, both boys and girls were steeped in sagas. Oral stories passed down from elders. Storytelling wasn't mere entertainment, it was education. Through tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors, children learned the values of courage, loyalty, wit, and honor. They memorized genealogies and battle epics, often reciting them in front of the family hearth. Children were taught to swim, ride, row, and fight, but also to sing and carve runes. By adolescence, many were fully functional adults. Some went raiding as young as 12 or 13. Their childhood was brief but meaningful, a forge where character was tempered as sharply as any Viking blade. Number 20. The end of the Viking Age was not the end of the Vikings. The Viking Age is traditionally said to have ended in 1066, with the death of King Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But the culture, descendants, and legacy of the Vikings endured long after. Vikings became kings, crusaders, settlers, and lords. The Normans, descendants of Norsemen who settled in northern France, conquered England shortly after, in that same year. Their language, laws, and customs shaped Europe. In Iceland, Norse traditions and sagas were preserved with remarkable accuracy. In Russia, Viking-founded cities grew into future power centers. Even in modern Scandinavian nations, Viking roots remain visible in language, customs, and national identity. The Viking spirit didn't vanish, it evolved. What began as oars striking waves became ideas, families, and empires carried forward across centuries. Number 21. Viking shields were both weapon and armor. Viking shields were round, lightweight, and incredibly versatile, not just for defense, but as part of offensive tactics. Made from layers of linden wood, a strong but light material, they usually measured around 80 to 90 centimeters in diameter and were reinforced with a central iron boss to protect the hand. Vikings used shields to form the feared shield wall, a tightly locked row of warriors that functioned like a human fortress. Each man's shield overlapped his neighbor's, forming a solid wall that could push forward like a wave. This formation was central to Norse battle tactics and required immense discipline. But shields could also be used aggressively, slamming into opponents, redirecting blows, or creating openings. Their design even allowed them to be thrown or used to misdirect arrows. Far from being a passive piece of equipment, the Viking shield was a tool of strategy, strength, and showmanship. Every bit as important as the sword it defended. Number 22. Norse mythology ends with the god's death. Unlike many mythologies where gods are eternal, Norse mythology concludes with Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, a final battle where the cosmos is consumed by fire, ice, and chaos. Odin is devoured by the wolf Fenrir, Thor kills the world serpent Jormungandr but dies from its venom, and Loki leads the giants against Asgard before meeting his end. This apocalypse isn't avoided, it's accepted. The Vikings believed that even the gods were bound by WYRD, fate, and their courage came not from hoping to survive, but from standing bravely even when defeat was certain. Yet Ragnarok is not pure annihilation. After the flames, a new world is born from the ashes. 2 humans, Lif and Lifrisia, survive by hiding in the roots of Yggdrasil and repopulate the earth. A few gods, like Balder, return. This cycle of destruction and rebirth gave Viking belief a profound tragic beauty. Glory wasn't in winning, it was in how you met your end. Number 23. Vikings were storytellers and poets. Norse culture was saturated with oral tradition. Skalds, Viking poets, were as honored as warriors. They composed and recited epic poems, called drapur, which celebrated kings, heroes, gods, and ancestors. These weren't just entertainment, they preserved history, culture, and lore. Their poetry was complex and rich in metaphors, called kennings. For example, the sea might be whale rowed, and a sword could be wound ice. These literary devices showed mastery of language and were passed down through memorization and performance. Even battles paused to allow skalds to document events. Rulers used them like PR agents to shape their legacy. In some courts, offending the skald could be a death sentence. Such was their cultural weight. Eventually, these oral poems were written down in works like the Poetic Edda and Prose Edda, preserving Viking worldview, myth, and identity for posterity. In a warrior society, the pen, or tongue, truly stood beside the sword. Number 24. Norse seers and magic workers held deep power. The Vikings believed in a form of magic called seer, practiced mainly by women known as vlur or seeresses. These women were feared and respected, often living outside of society and acting as oracles, healers, and mediators between the worlds of gods and men. Seer involved entering trance states to speak with spirits or see the future. A famous account in the saga of Eric the Red describes a VLVA dressed in blue robes and a cloak adorned with stones, seated on a high platform and chanting to summon spirits. Odin himself was a master of seer, which was considered unmanly and taboo for men. But his mastery showed that wisdom was worth such sacrifices. Magic users were consulted in times of crisis, before voyages, battles, or political decisions. Their rituals, staffs, and chants were part of a living tradition of Norse mysticism. In Viking eyes, true power wasn't just muscle, it was vision, knowledge, and connection to the unseen. Number 25. Viking Age Iceland was a republic without a king. When Norse settlers arrived in Iceland around 870 CE, they brought with them a unique blend of independence and lawfulness. Unlike other territories, Iceland never had a king during the Viking Age. Instead, it operated as a commonwealth with no central ruler. The country was governed by the Althing, a national assembly where chieftains, called Gor, gathered yearly at Ingvella. There, they settled disputes, recited laws from memory, and voted on key matters. Participation was open to all free men, and the entire system relied on consensus, honor, and social pressure. It was a remarkably advanced form of proto-democracy for its time. The law speaker, elected for 3-year terms, was the only official position and held immense cultural authority. Iceland's legal and literary traditions, born of this structure, gave us the sagas, arguably the most vivid historical records of Viking life. Number 26. Viking exploration changed the genetic map of Europe. Modern DNA analysis reveals the profound biological legacy of the Viking Age. Genetic studies have traced Scandinavian ancestry across the British Isles, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, and even parts of Russia and Turkey. A 2020 study of over 400 ancient genomes revealed surprising diversity in Viking communities. Viking warriors buried in England included people of mixed ancestry: Scandinavian, Slavic, and even Middle Eastern. In some places, Norse settlers merged completely into local populations within a few generations. In Iceland, genetic records are particularly clear. Most male ancestry is Norse, but a majority of female lines are Celtic, suggesting Norsemen brought women from the British Isles, often through raiding or marriage. Vikings didn't just leave behind sagas, they altered the literal DNA of Europe, weaving their bloodlines into the continent's future. Number 27. Vikings played strategic board games. The Vikings loved board games, and one of their favorites was Nefertafel, a strategy game similar to chess. Played on a checkered board, it involved asymmetric sides, a king and defenders in the center trying to escape, while attackers tried to trap him. It wasn't just a game of luck, but of skill, wit, and planning, qualities admired in Viking leaders. Kings were often expected to be not just warriors, but thinkers. Playing Nefertafel showed one's intellect and strategic prowess. Archaeological digs have uncovered ornate game pieces made of bone, amber, and walrus ivory, often buried with their owners. Some pieces were carved into abstract animal forms or warriors. Games were more than pastime. They were reflections of Viking values, tactical thinking, honor, and the ability to foresee consequences. Number 28. Viking slavery fueled their economy. A dark truth often overlooked is that Viking wealth was partly built on the back of slavery. They captured and traded thousands of people, called thralls, across Europe. Slaves were taken during raids, especially in Ireland, Scotland, and Slavic territories, and sold in bustling markets from Dublin to Constantinople. Thralls were used as farm labourers, household servants, concubines, and even human sacrifices. While some could eventually buy freedom or be freed by kind masters, most lived harsh, subservient lives. The Viking slave trade connected them to vast economic networks. In the east, Slavic slaves were sent down the rivers to the Byzantine Empire and Islamic caliphates. In the west, Irish thralls were sold in Iceland or shipped to Norway. Their economy wasn't just fur and silver, it was human lives. Recognizing this gives us a fuller, if more uncomfortable, picture of Viking society. Number 29. Viking art was intricate and symbolic. Though often thought of as crude warriors, the Vikings created deeply intricate and symbolic artwork. Their designs featured interlaced beasts, dragons, and knots, carved into wood, bone, metal, and stone. These styles, like the urns or boar styles, changed over time but maintained a distinct visual language. Art adorned everyday objects, brooches, weapons, ships, furniture. Animal motifs were particularly significant, representing power, guardianship, and connection to the gods. One famous artifact, the Oseberg ship, was filled with exquisite carvings, tapestries, and wagon fittings, demonstrating a level of artistic sophistication rivaling any medieval European court. Even runestones were designed to impress, combining inscriptions with serpentine patterns. The aesthetic wasn't just beauty for beauty's sake. It was a form of storytelling, identity, and spiritual resonance. Viking art captured not just what they saw, but what they believed. Number 30. The Viking legacy lives in language. Modern English bears the heavy imprint of Old Norse. During centuries of Viking presence in England and Scotland, Norse words were absorbed into the language. Words like sky, knife, egg, window, law, husband, and die all trace back to Viking tongues. Even grammar was affected. The simplification of English verb endings and the shift from Old English rigid word order to the more flexible structure we know today may have been influenced by the blending of Anglo-Saxon and Norse speakers. Place names offer the clearest mark. Any English town ending in by, like Derby, Whitby, Thorpe, like Scunthorpe, or Thwaite, like Satterthwaite, has Viking origins. These suffixes come from Norse words for farm, village, or clearing. Language is memory, and the Norse left theirs carved into the tongue of an entire nation. Number 31. Viking duels were ritualized trials of honor. When disputes arose and no peaceful solution could be reached, Vikings sometimes turned to the holmgang, a formal duel used to settle arguments over property, honor, or legal matters. The term means going to a small island, as these battles often took place on secluded patches of land where no one could interfere. Home gangs had strict rules. Combatants were allowed specific weapons, typically swords or axes, and fought within a designated space, often marked by a hide or cloak laid on the ground. Leaving the space meant forfeiting. Sometimes, a second, a shield bearer, would accompany each fighter. Victory could restore honor, grant land, or even settle a blood feud. However, because some skilled fighters abused the system to legally rob others, home gangs were eventually outlawed in Iceland by the 11th century. This ritualized violence shows how seriously Vikings treated personal integrity and public perception. Honor was life itself. Number 32. They used nicknames to define identity. Viking names were often paired with descriptive nicknames, which could refer to a person's appearance, deeds, personality, or even quirks. These weren't playful additions, they were integral parts of identity and reputation. Some were fearsome: Eric the Red, named for his fiery hair and temper; Eva the Boneless, whose nickname may suggest either extreme flexibility, a disease like brittle bone syndrome, or metaphorical fearlessness. Others were humorous or ironic: Halfdan the Generous and the Stingy with Food, or Kettle Flatnose. Nicknames were earned, not chosen. They could immortalize a person's legend or embarrass them for life. In sagas, these monikers were so important that characters were introduced by them more than by formal lineage. In a society where stories kept the dead alive, a name was a weapon, a mirror, and a legacy. Number 33. They farmed and worshipped the land. Despite their seafaring fame, most Vikings were farmers, not raiders. The Norse economy revolved around small family farms growing barley, rye, and oats, and raising animals like cattle, pigs, and sheep. Farming in Scandinavia was tough due to rocky soil and short growing seasons, but the Vikings adapted with crop rotation and efficient land use. Agriculture wasn't just survival, it was spiritual. The god Freyr was worshipped as the lord of fertility, crops, and peace. Offerings were made at planting and harvest, and sacred groves and stones were often dedicated to him. Even in Iceland, where soil was poor, Viking settlers cultivated land carefully. The Landnámabók, or Book of Settlements, documents how early Icelanders divided territory to ensure fairness and survival. They may have sailed far, but their hearts were rooted in the soil. For every raid across the sea, there were months of tending goats, sowing fields, and praying for rain. Number 34. Viking ships were sacred spaces. The longship wasn't just a tool, it was a living, sacred extension of Norse identity. Often carved with dragon heads or serpents, these proud decorations were meant to ward off spirits and intimidate enemies. During peaceful visits, the prow's head was removed to avoid offending local land spirits. Shipbuilding was a communal art. Shipwrights selected trees carefully, often from sacred groves, and believed the spirit of the tree lived on in the vessel. Ships had names, personalities, and even omens associated with their first voyages. When a chief or warrior died, burial in a ship symbolized the passage to the afterlife. The Oseberg burial is a stunning example: a full-size ship placed in a mound, filled with luxurious goods, animals, and two women whose roles are still debated. The ship was more than a vehicle. It was destiny carved in wood, carrying Vikings across the sea and into legend. Number 35. Viking astronomy was practical and mythical. The night sky held deep meaning for the Vikings. Stars guided their navigation, while constellations were woven into myth. They tracked seasons through the movement of the sun and moon, often aligning buildings and ritual sites with celestial events. The Norse recognized the Pleiades, calling them Freya's hens, and likely understood the North Star, Polaris, as a fixed point of orientation. They built sun compasses and used shadow sticks, early sundials, to measure time. In mythology, the cosmos itself was astronomical. The sun and moon were personified as deities chased by wolves. When the wolves caught them, an eclipse, chaos was believed to begin, heralding Ragnarok. Though they lacked telescopes, Viking stargazers combined observation and imagination. The sky was both a clock and a canvas, a place where gods fought and sailors found their way. Number 36. The Norse believed the dead could walk. The Vikings feared a type of undead known as a draugr, a restless corpse that left its burial mound to torment the living. Draugr retained their intelligence, strength, and malice. Some guarded treasure, others sought revenge. They could grow in size, pass through walls, and cause sickness or madness. Graves were sometimes fortified with heavy stones or iron to keep draugr from rising. Special rituals were performed during burials. Placing scissors on the chest, tying the big toes together, or driving stakes through the body. The saga literature is filled with terrifying tales of draugr. In Grettir's saga, the hero fights a powerful undead in a burial mound in a scene as chilling as any modern horror story. To the Norse, death wasn't the end. A badly buried soul might become a danger, and proper funeral rites were a community's sacred duty. Number 37. Viking laws protected trees and animals. A break time equals 0. 5s/. While Vikings are often seen as destroyers, their legal codes reveal a surprising respect for nature and balance. Early Icelandic lawbooks like Graga's included protections for forests, grazing lands, and animals. Illegal logging or damaging someone's pasture could result in fines or outlawry. Hunting was seasonal and regulated, especially for game like whales and seabirds. Overfishing or excessive sealing was discouraged, particularly in communities that depended on fragile ecosystems. Even magical significance was tied to nature. Sacred groves were places of worship, and certain animals, like ravens and wolves, were messengers of Odin or Freya. Harming them without cause could bring bad luck or spiritual consequences. The Norse understood that survival meant harmony with the land, not just domination of it. Nature was feared, fed, and fiercely respected. Number 38. Viking Age glass came from the Middle East. Among Viking grave goods and settlements, archaeologists have found thousands of glass beads, cups, and vessels, many of which originated in the Islamic world. These finely crafted objects were traded through the expansive Viking network stretching from Baghdad to Scandinavia. Some beads were made in Mesopotamia or Syria and traveled north along the Volga trade routes. Their presence in humble Viking graves shows how widespread and accessible this luxury became. Vikings prized glass not just for beauty, but for its exotic origin. It was a marker of wealth, taste, and global connection. Warriors might wear colored beads in their beards. Women strung them into elaborate necklaces and brooches. The discovery of Islamic inscriptions on Viking grave items proves a cultural and commercial exchange far more nuanced than conquest alone. Number 39. Vikings drank mead, beer, and sometimes hallucinogens. Mead, fermented honey wine, was the Viking drink of the gods. In Norse myth, the mead of poetry gave divine wisdom. Vikings brewed it at home with honey, water, and herbs, storing it in barrels or clay jars. Beer was common, too, made from barley and flavored with herbs like yarrow or juniper. Strong drink was central to feasts, oaths, and funerals. Drinking horns were passed around in ritualized order, and drunkenness wasn't shameful, unless it led to Dishna. Some evidence suggests that berserkers may have consumed hallucinogenic mushrooms, like Amanita muscaria, before battle to induce trance and rage. Seeresses and shamans also used intoxicants to enter altered states during rituals. Alcohol wasn't just pleasure, it was portal, sacrament, and weapon. In Viking culture, drink could elevate a soul or unleash a beast. Number 40. Viking women traveled the world. Viking women weren't confined to hearth and home. They traveled across Europe and beyond. Grave finds from England, Russia, and even Birka in Sweden reveal high-status women buried with foreign goods, weapons, and symbols of authority. Women accompanied raiding parties and merchant voyages, sometimes as settlers, sometimes as negotiators or even warriors. In the sagas, women like Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir sailed to Vinland, North America, while others like Freydis Eiríksdóttir fought in battles and explored new lands. Some women served as diplomats or ran estates while their husbands were away. Widows often inherited land and led entire settlements. Far from being passive, Viking women were agents of exploration, commerce, and colonization. Their footsteps can be traced across half the globe, and their stories echo in both sagas and soil. Number 41. The Berserkers, warriors who fought in a trance. Among the most feared Viking warriors were the Berserkers, legendary fighters said to enter battle in a state of uncontrollable rage. Clad in bearskins, from which the word berserker likely derives, bear for bear, circa for shirt, these men were thought to channel the power of wild animals. Ancient sources describe them howling like wolves, biting their shields, and becoming impervious to pain or injury during combat. Some scholars believe berserkers may have entered these frenzied states through ritualistic practices or even psychoactive substances, such as Amanita muscaria mushrooms, known for their hallucinogenic properties. Others argue it may have been a form of self-induced hysteria, trance, or battle hypnosis. Whatever the cause, berserkers terrify their enemies and sometimes even their own allies. Kings like Harald Fairhair are said to have kept berserkers as personal bodyguards, while later Christian laws in Norway outright banned berserker behavior, suggesting that their reputation lingered long after the Viking Age had faded. Number 42. The Viking who became a Byzantine emperor's guard. Vikings didn't just raid west, they also ventured far to the east, and many found their way into the service of the Byzantine Empire. The most famous of these was the Varangian Guard, an elite unit composed largely of Norse warriors who served as personal bodyguards to the Byzantine emperors. One such Norseman, Harald Hardrada, left Norway as a young man after the Battle of Stiklestad and travelled to Constantinople. There, he entered the service of the Byzantine emperor, rising through the ranks due to his ferocity and tactical acumen. He fought in Sicily, the Holy Land, and against pirates in the Mediterranean. His exploits earned him immense wealth, and he eventually returned to Norway to claim the throne. But perhaps the most remarkable part is the lasting presence of the Varangian Guard. Even long after Norse culture had faded from most of Europe, Greek and Eastern Roman sources describe these fearsome, axe-wielding, blonde warriors who stood at the emperor's side, speaking Old Norse well into the 11th century. Number 43. Viking Skalds, the poets who preserved history in verse. While many view the Vikings as brutes and raiders, their culture deeply valued the art of poetry. Skalds were Viking poets who composed complex, alliterative verse, often in praise of kings or to commemorate battles and heroic deeds. Their verses were not only entertainment but also a means of recording history. Skaldic poetry was orally transmitted and adhered to strict structural rules, with complicated meters like Drukveit, which required internal rhymes, kennings, poetic metaphors, and exact syllabic structure. A skald might describe a ship not as a boat, but as a sea steed or call blood the battle serpents drink. One of the most famous skalds was Snorri Sturluson, an Icelandic historian and poet who recorded many of the sagas and mythologies that inform our understanding of Norse beliefs today. His work, the Prose Edda, stands as a vital link to the Viking worldview, from creation myths to Ragnarok. Skalds were so important that their words were sometimes used in legal contexts to validate genealogies or past events. Number 44. The woman who fought at Birka. In the 1880s, archaeologists excavating a Viking grave in Birka, Sweden found a warrior buried with full battle gear: sword, axe, spear, armor-piercing arrows, 2 shields, and 2 horses. It was long assumed to be a male grave, given the rich warrior accoutrements. But in 2017, a team of scientists conducted DNA analysis and shocked the academic world. The warrior was a woman. This revelation challenged centuries-old assumptions about gender roles in Viking society. The grave, designated BJ 581, was not simply ceremonial. The positioning of the artifacts, as well as their quality, suggested this was a high-ranking warrior, perhaps even a commander. While sagas like those of Lagertha and Freydis Eiríksdóttir had long told of warrior women, many dismissed them as myth. But BJ 581 showed that at least some Viking women not only fought, but led. This discovery continues to reshape how we understand gender in Viking society, revealing a more complex and egalitarian culture than previously thought. Number 45. Viking runestones, messages to the living and the dead. Scattered across Scandinavia are thousands of runestones, carved monuments inscribed with runes, the ancient Norse writing system. These stones often marked graves or commemorated deeds, both mundane and heroic. Far from being grim, many runestones speak of love, loss, and longing. One, the Jelling Stone in Denmark, erected by King Harald Bluetooth, commemorates the unification of Denmark and his conversion to Christianity. Another, the Rock Stone in Sweden, holds the longest known runic inscription and is thought to reference battles, mythology, and possibly even climate disaster. Some stones are placed along roads or paths as public statements to honor the dead or assert inheritance rights. They were written in the Futhark alphabet, named for its first 6 letters, and often used poetic phrasing and stylized iconography. The stones not only served as memorials but also as declarations of power, piety, and prestige. They show us that while Vikings valued violence and strength, they also deeply respected memory and storytelling. Number 46. The Viking chest set found in a sand dune. In 1831, on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland, a local man uncovered one of the most iconic Viking artifacts ever discovered, the Lewis chessmen. Buried in a sand dune and made of walrus ivory and whale teeth, the 93 intricately carved pieces depict medieval characters like kings, bishops, knights, and rooks, though the rooks are portrayed as fierce, sword-wielding warriors. Dating from the 12th century, likely from Norway, these chessmen reveal the depth of Viking culture's engagement with art, leisure, and intellectual pursuit. The level of detail is astonishing. Wide-eyed expressions, ornamental thrones, and battle gear suggest both playful creativity and keen social commentary. Chess itself likely came to the Norse world from the east via trade routes, and owning such a set would have been a mark of elite status. The Lewis chessmen demonstrate that the Vikings were not only conquerors but also connoisseurs, capable of artistry, humor, and a desire to mimic and master the cultural symbols of the broader medieval world. Number 47. The myth of the blood eagle. One of the most gruesome images associated with Viking cruelty is the blood eagle. A supposed ritual execution where a victim's back was sliced open, the ribs broken and spread like wings, and the lungs pulled out and laid across the back while the victim still lived. This horrifying method is mentioned in sagas like that of Ragnar Lodbrok, whose sons allegedly performed the rite on King Orella of Northumbria in revenge for their father's death. But did it really happen? Modern historians debate its authenticity. Some argue the descriptions were metaphorical or mistranslated. What may have been intended as poetic metaphor was taken literally by later writers. Others believe it may have occurred but only as an exceptionally rare act of vengeance, not common practice. Whether real or exaggerated, the blood eagle captured the imagination of later medieval chroniclers and modern audiences alike, becoming a symbol of Viking brutality, but also of how myth and history often intertwine in Norse storytelling. Number 48. Viking longboats. The secret of their reach. What allowed the Vikings to raid, trade, and settle from the Arctic to the Mediterranean and even to North America? The answer lies in their longboats, marvels of naval engineering. Viking longships were lightweight, flexible, and fast, with shallow drafts that allowed them to navigate both open sea and shallow rivers. Built using the clinker technique, overlapping planks fastened with iron rivets, these ships were both sturdy and responsive. They could be rowed or sailed, and were capable of speeds up to 15 knots. The Gokstad and Oseberg ships, unearthed in Norway, remain some of the best preserved examples, showing ornate carvings and functional designs. Their mobility gave Vikings unparalleled reach. They sailed up the Seine, attacked Paris, and slipped away before retaliation. They explored Iceland, Greenland, and even parts of the Middle East. Their ships weren't just war vessels. They were lifelines, linking Viking communities across vast distances and securing their dominance over trade and territory for centuries. Number 49. The Thing, Viking democracy in action. While Viking society had kings and chieftains, it also had a strong tradition of participatory governance through assemblies known as the Thing. These gatherings, held at regular intervals, brought free men together to settle disputes, pass laws, and make decisions for their communities. Iceland's Althing, founded in 930 CE, is the oldest surviving parliament in the world. At these meetings, laws were recited from memory by the law speaker, and disputes could be settled by negotiation, arbitration, or combat. The Thing also functioned as a social event, with trade, feasting, and matchmaking. Women could attend and sometimes testify, and in some cases, widows or heiresses could influence decisions through wealth or family alliances. The Thing reflected the Norse ideal of honor and fairness. Justice wasn't handed down from above, but built through consensus and debate. This proto-democratic system, while limited to the free male population, was a striking contrast to the more rigid hierarchies of other medieval societies. Number 50. The Viking Apocalypse. Belief in Ragnarok. Norse mythology didn't envision a golden afterlife for all. Instead, it anticipated Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods and the end of the world. According to legend, a great winter would descend, the Fimbulwinter, plunging the world into chaos. Brothers would turn on brothers, monsters would roam free, and the gods themselves would fall. Odin would be devoured by the wolf Fenrir, Thor would kill the serpent Jormungandr but die from its poison, and Loki would fight against the gods in a final battle. The seas would rise, the sky would darken, and fire would consume the world. Yet from the ashes, a new earth would emerge, green, fertile, and peaceful. Two humans, Lif and Lithrasia, would survive and repopulate the world. Ragnarok was not just a doom prophecy, it reflected the Viking understanding of cycles, balance, and renewal. It acknowledged that even gods die, that chaos is inevitable, and that life always begins again, even after the darkest night. Bonus facts about the famous Viking berserkers. Among the most fearsome and mysterious warriors in Viking lore were the berserkers, ferocious fighters who, according to saga accounts, would charge into battle howling like animals, immune to pain, and seemingly possessed by an uncontrollable rage. The very word berserker has become synonymous with wild, uncontrollable fury, and the image of these warriors has long captivated the imagination of historians and storytellers alike. But what actually caused these warriors to enter such an intense state of frenzy? The Norse sagas, such as the Ynglinga saga and Ravnsmoll, describe berserkers as Odin's chosen warriors, often wearing nothing but bear or wolf skins. Hence the name berserker, believed to mean either bear shirt or bear shirt, implying they fought without armor. In battle, they were said to be impervious to steel and fire, biting their shields, frothing at the mouth, and attacking with a strength that bordered on the supernatural. For centuries, historians assumed this was either mythological exaggeration or religious fervor. However, modern researchers have proposed a far more intriguing theory: that berserkers may have entered altered states of consciousness through the use of psychoactive substances, essentially Viking-era combat drugs. One of the most prominent theories is that berserkers consumed Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric mushroom, easily recognizable by its red cap with white spots. This mushroom contains psychoactive compounds like muscimol and ibotenic acid, which can induce hallucinations, distorted perception of pain, and erratic behavior. Intriguingly, fly agaric was used by Siberian shamans for similar trance-like states, and the cultural parallels are difficult to ignore. The effects of Amanita muscaria align closely with descriptions of berserkers in combat. Users report overwhelming energy surges, confusion, visions, and an inability to distinguish reality from hallucination. Combined with a pre-battle ritual, intense chanting, and the warriors' belief that Odin had possessed them, this could easily have resulted in the kind of frenzied, fearsome warrior described in sagas. Others suggest the use of henbane, a poisonous plant found throughout Scandinavia. Unlike fly agaric, henbane contains tropane alkaloids, powerful hallucinogens and deliriants that can cause sensations of invulnerability, wild agitation, and even temporary insanity. A 2020 study by archaeobotanist Carson Fatter supported this theory, arguing that henbane was more accessible and its effects more consistent with berserker behavior. Seeds of henbane have even been found at Viking archaeological sites. But it wasn't just the chemical effects that made berserkers terrifying, it was also psychological warfare. The sight of a foaming, screaming warrior sprinting into battle wearing a wolf pelt and seeming impervious to wounds would have been enough to terrify even a seasoned enemy. To their foes, berserkers may have looked less like men and more like beasts or gods. However, this violent and unpredictable behavior had its consequences. Later Viking laws banned berserker rage, recognizing that such uncontrollable warriors were dangerous even to their own people. The Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law code, forbade berserker behavior and classified it as a criminal offense. By the Christianization of Scandinavia, berserkers were often portrayed as villains or demonic, outcasts rather than champions. In the end, the legend of the berserkers endures as one of the most dramatic illustrations of how the Vikings combined ritual, belief, and biology to create warriors who straddled the line between man and monster. Whether through mushrooms, madness, or myth, their legacy is burned into the chronicles of history, terrifying, fascinating, and utterly unique.